The crack of gunfire echoed through the valley as Sienna Roberts huddled behind a fallen oak, her heart pounding wildly against her ribs. It was 1878 in the Montana Territory, and she had never imagined her journey west would lead her here, caught in the crossfire of a town's hatred and one man's desperate fight to clear his name. Miles Crawford ducked low behind his chestnut mare, his weathered face set in grim determination. 4 days on the run from Whispering Pines had left him exhausted, his reputation in tatters and a price on his head for a murder he didn't commit. The posse was closing in, their shouts carrying on the wind. "There he is! Get the murderer!" Sienna peered around the tree trunk, her auburn hair falling loose from its pins as she watched the stranger. He didn't look like a killer. His eyes, deep blue and haunted, met hers across the distance. For a moment, the world stilled. "Please," he mouthed, a desperate plea in those 2 silent syllables. She made her decision in a heartbeat. Standing from her hiding place, she waved her arms toward the approaching riders. "He went west," she called out, pointing in the opposite direction from where the man crouched. "Saw him heading toward Bear Creek not 10 minutes past." The leader of the posse, a barrel-chested man with a tin star pinned to his vest, slowed his horse. "You sure, miss?" "Certain as sunrise," Sienna replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Nearly trampled me as I was gathering herbs." She held up her basket as evidence, thankful she'd actually been foraging when the chaos erupted. The sheriff hesitated, eyes narrowing with suspicion, but ultimately raised his arm to direct his men westward. "Bear Creek, boys, we'll cut him off at the pass." When the thunder of hooves faded into the distance, Sienna approached the stranger cautiously. "They'll figure out I lied soon enough. We don't have much time." Miles Crawford emerged slowly from behind his horse, one hand still resting on his revolver. "Why would you help me?" "You don't know me from Adam." "I know what a hunted animal looks like," she replied, meeting his gaze squarely. "And I know what a killer looks like. You're not one." His shoulders sagged slightly. "Name's Miles Crawford. And I didn't kill Samuel Thornton, though every soul in Whispering Pines believes otherwise." "Sienna Roberts," she returned. "I have a cabin about 3 miles east. You can rest there while we figure out what to do." "We?" Miles questioned, his voice rough with disbelief. "Someone framed you, Mr. Crawford. I'd like to know why." As they rode toward her homestead, Sienna felt a strange certainty settle in her chest. Her life had changed course today, as surely as if the river had jumped its banks. There would be no going back. Sienna's cabin was modest but well-tended, nestled in a grove of pines with a small creek running nearby. She had inherited it from her uncle 8 months ago, after he'd passed from pneumonia. The townsfolk of Whispering Pines had been cordial but distant toward the newcomer. A single woman living alone was oddly suspect, even if she was 24 and perfectly capable. "It's not much," she said, dismounting and leading her dappled mare to the small stable. "But it's off the main trail. They won't look here right away." Miles dismounted stiffly, favoring his right leg. Now that they were in better light, Sienna could see the dark stain on his trousers. "You're wounded," she stated, not a question. "Bullet grazed me yesterday. It's nothing." Sienna's eyebrows rose. "Sit on the porch. I'll tend to it after I see to the horses." To her surprise, he didn't argue, simply limped to the rough-hewn bench and lowered himself with a barely suppressed groan. By the time she returned from the stable, Miles had removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with early silver at the temples. His face, now relaxed from the immediate danger, showed the lines of a man who'd spent years under the open sky. "How long have you been riding?" she asked, bringing her medical supplies to the porch. 4 days, he answered, watching warily as she knelt before him. Left Whispering Pines the night Thornton was murdered. Sheriff Matthews found me standing over the body, gun in hand. Sienna carefully cut away the fabric around his wound. And you didn't kill him? No, madam, I did not. His jaw tightened. Thornton and I had our differences. Everyone in town knew it. He was buying up land, forcing folks out. My ranch was next on his list. We argued that afternoon in full view of half the town, but I didn't kill him. The wound was angry and inflamed, but thankfully not too deep. Sienna cleaned it methodically, noting how Miles barely flinched despite what must have been considerable pain. Then what happened? She prompted. Got a note that evening. Said to meet at Thornton's office, that he was reconsidering his offer on my land. When I got there, he was already dead, shot through the heart. Miles shook his head. I was fool enough to pick up the gun. That's when Sheriff Matthews walked in. Sienna bound his leg with clean bandages. The real killer must have known you'd be blamed. That's my thinking. There's a handful of men who stand to profit from Thornton's death and from me hanging for it. After finishing with his leg, Sienna stood and dusted off her skirts. You need rest and food. Then we'll figure out how to clear your name. Miles caught her wrist gently. Why are you helping me? You could be arrested for harboring a fugitive. Her green eyes met his directly. My father was hanged for a crime he didn't commit when I was 16. No one would listen to the evidence that could have saved him. She pulled her hand away. I won't watch another innocent man die if I can help it. Over a simple supper of rabbit stew and cornbread, Miles told Sienna more about Samuel Thornton and the town of Whispering Pines. The cattle baron had arrived 3 years prior with deep pockets and grand ambitions, buying the struggling bank and using it to acquire property throughout the county. Half the town loves him for bringing in money and prospects. The other half resents him for pushing out the original settlers. Miles tore off a piece of cornbread. I'm in the second group. My father built our ranch from nothing 20 years ago. Thornton offered me half what it's worth, then threatened to call in loans when I refused. Did he have that kind of power? Sienna asked, refilling his coffee cup. Owns the bank now. Most folks are in debt to him one way or another. Miles sighed. There are others who hated him more than I did. Roger Parker lost his store. The McDaniels were forced off their farm. Even the mayor, Harrison Wells, was at odds with him over some railroad deal. Sienna considered this information. We need to find evidence pointing to the real killer. Do you have any allies in town? Miles hesitated. Doc Sullivan might help. He never much cared for Thornton's methods, and the blacksmith, Gabe Foster, is an old friend. Then that's where we'll start, Sienna decided. I can go into town tomorrow. No one will suspect me of helping you, Miles frowned. It's too dangerous. You've done enough already. Mr. Crawford, I may look delicate, but I'm not. She smiled slightly. Besides, they're not looking for a woman. I can move about freely. Late that night, as Miles slept in her small guest room, Sienna sat by the fireplace planning their next moves. The rational part of her mind questioned her impulsive decision to help this stranger. Yet something in his eyes had resonated with her, the same desperate honesty she'd seen in her father's face when no one would believe him. She thought back to Philadelphia, the life she'd left behind after her father's death. Teaching at the girls' school had been respectable but hollow. When Uncle Thomas's letter arrived offering her his cabin in Montana if she wanted a fresh start, she'd seized the opportunity. Now, 8 months later, she was harboring a fugitive and plotting to catch a murderer. Sienna smiled to herself. Perhaps she was more like her adventurous father than she'd realized. Morning arrived with a heavy mist clinging to the pines. Sienna dressed carefully in her most respectable outfit, a navy blue skirt and white shirtwaist that she reserved for trips to town. She pinned her hair neatly beneath her bonnet and packed her basket as if for a normal shopping trip. Miles watched her preparations with obvious concern. "If anyone suspects you're helping me—" "They won't," she interrupted. "I'll simply be gathering information. Town gossip is invaluable and ladies love to talk." "Be careful around Sheriff Matthews," Miles warned. "He's not a bad man, but he's stubborn as a mule once he's made up his mind. And he's decided I'm guilty." Sienna nodded, checking that she had enough money in her purse. "I'll be back before sundown. There's stew left from last night if you get hungry. And Miles," she paused at the door, "stay inside, please. Your leg needs rest and we can't risk someone spotting you." The ride to Whispering Pines took nearly an hour. As Sienna approached the town, she rehearsed her story. She needed supplies and medicine perfectly reasonable. If anyone mentioned the manhunt for Miles Crawford, she would express appropriate shock and concern like any proper lady would. Whispering Pines had sprung up around silver mining in the 1850s, but had transitioned to ranching and farming when the mines dried up. The main street boasted a general store, saloon, hotel, church, and various other establishments typical of a growing frontier town. As Sienna tied her horse outside the general store, she noted the wanted poster with Miles's likeness prominently displayed on the sheriff's office door. "Miss Roberts, what brings you to town today?" Mrs. Patterson, the storekeeper's wife, greeted her warmly. "Good morning, Mrs. Patterson." "I've run low on flour and coffee," Sienna replied with a friendly smile. "And I heard there was quite a commotion a few days ago. Is everyone all right?" Mrs. Patterson's expression turned grave. "Oh my, you haven't heard. Samuel Thornton was murdered, shot dead in his own office. And Miles Crawford did it standing right there with the gun when Sheriff Matthews found him." Sienna arranged her features into a mask of shock. "How dreadful. I only met Mr. Thornton briefly when I first arrived." "A tragedy, that's what it is. Mr. Thornton had such plans for this town." Mrs. Patterson leaned closer. "Crawford's been on the run for days. The sheriff and his men are out searching now. They say they nearly caught him yesterday, but he slipped away." "How frightening to think of a murderer on the loose," Sienna commented, selecting items from the shelves. "Did anyone witness the shooting?" "Not the shooting itself, but half the town saw Crawford arguing with Thornton that very afternoon. Threatened him, he did." As Mrs. Patterson continued gossiping, Sienna gathered valuable information. The murder weapon belonged to Thornton himself, a pearl-handled revolver he kept in his desk. The office hadn't been robbed. And most importantly, Thornton had been meeting with several business associates the day he died, including Mayor Wells and a representative from the railroad company. After purchasing her supplies, Sienna made her way to the doctor's office, remembering Miles's suggestion that Doc Sullivan might be sympathetic. The elderly physician was just returning from a house call when she approached. "Miss Roberts, are you feeling unwell?" he asked, noting her presence outside his office. "Actually, doctor, I was hoping to purchase some additional bandages and liniment. I've been having trouble with my hands from all the gardening." She held up her palms, which genuinely showed some calluses from her homesteading work. "Of course, come inside." He unlocked his door and gestured for her to enter. Once they were alone in his office, Sienna decided to take a chance. "Dr. Sullivan, what do you think about the Thornton murder? Do you believe Miles Crawford is guilty?" The doctor paused in his gathering of supplies, studying her carefully. "That's an odd question from someone who hardly knows either man." Sienna met his gaze steadily. "I've always believed in justice, doctor, and sometimes public opinion rushes to judgment too quickly." After a long moment, Sullivan sighed. "Between us, Miss Roberts, I find the circumstances suspicious. Crawford never struck me as a fool, and only a fool would kill a man and then stand around waiting to be caught. He wrapped the bandages and liniment in paper, but what I think hardly matters. The evidence seems clear enough. Unless it was arranged to look that way, Sienna suggested quietly. The doctor's eyebrows rose. Be careful with such speculations, young lady. Thornton had powerful friends who are eager to see Crawford hang. He handed her the package. That'll be 50 cents. As she paid him, Sullivan added in a lower voice, if you're interested in the truth, you might want to speak with Ruth Wilson at the telegraph office. She knows more about the town's business than anyone. Sienna nodded her thanks, understanding the subtle hint. The telegraph office was her next stop. Ruth Wilson was a thin woman in her 40s with sharp eyes that missed nothing. When Sienna entered on the pretense of sending a letter to a fictional friend in Denver, the telegrapher greeted her with polite efficiency. Miss Wilson, Sienna said after composing her message, this business with Mr. Thornton is quite shocking. I've heard he was meeting with several people the day he died. Ruth's expression remained professional, but her eyes narrowed slightly. News travels fast, even to those living outside town. Mrs. Patterson is quite informative, Sienna replied with a smile. I gathered Mr. Thornton was an important man with many business dealings. After a moment's hesitation, Ruth nodded. He had meetings all afternoon. The mayor was there for nearly an hour, then Mr. Collins from the railroad. After that, Walter Jenkins about some cattle he was selling. She lowered her voice. And there was another man not from around here, wore an expensive suit. They argued something fierce. Did you catch his name? Didn't say, but I heard him mention Denver Pacific Investment Company. Ruth straightened some papers on her desk. That'll be 25 cents for the telegram. As Sienna left the telegraph office, her mind was racing. A stranger arguing with Thornton the day of his murder seemed significant. And the Denver Pacific Investment Company, that was a new piece of information. Her final stop was the blacksmith's forge. Gabe Foster was hammering a horseshoe when she approached, his massive arms glistening with sweat in the heat of the forge. Afternoon, Miss Roberts, he greeted her, setting aside his hammer. Your mare need new shoes. Not today, Mr. Foster. I'm actually looking for information. She glanced around to ensure they were alone. About Miles Crawford. The blacksmith's friendly expression closed immediately. Don't know where he is, if that's what you're asking. It's not, Sienna assured him. I'm trying to understand what happened. Miles mentioned you were a friend. Foster studied her for a long moment, then set down his tools. Come inside. In the relative privacy of his small, attached home, Foster spoke more freely. Miles didn't kill Thornton. He's not that kind of man. I believe that too, Sienna said quietly. Did Miles ever mention anything about the Denver Pacific Investment Company? Foster frowned. Not by name, but he did say Thornton had partners back east who were pressuring him about some big land deal. The railroad's planning a new spur line through the valley, and whoever owns the land stands to make a fortune. Including Miles's ranch, Sienna asked, especially his place. It sits right where they'd need to put the junction. Foster shook his head. Miles refused to sell, and that was causing problems for Thornton's investors. As the pieces began coming together in her mind, Sienna heard voices outside. Peering through the window, she saw Sheriff Matthews and 2 deputies riding back into town. I should go, she said quickly. Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Foster. Miss Roberts, he called as she reached the door. If you see Miles, tell him he's got friends here who know the truth. Not everyone believes he's guilty. The sun was beginning its westward descent as Sienna rode out of town, her mind buzzing with all she'd learned. The sheriff's return meant the posse had given up the search for today, but they would resume tomorrow. She and Miles needed to work quickly. When she arrived back at the cabin, she found Miles standing on the porch, rifle in hand. He lowered it with visible relief when he recognized her. "You're later than I expected," he said, taking the reins of her horse. "I had many conversations to navigate." Sienna dismounted, stretching her tired muscles. "And I believe I've found some threads worth pulling." Inside, she shared everything she'd learned while preparing a simple dinner. Miles listened intently, pacing despite his injured leg. "Denver Pacific Investment Company," he repeated. "That fits." Thornton mentioned investors who wouldn't be happy about delays. "And the railroad spur explains why my land suddenly became so valuable." "Who stands to benefit most from Thornton's death?" Sienna asked, setting plates on the table. "Mayor Wells, for one. He's been trying to get in on Thornton's deals for months." Miles sat heavily in a chair. "But there's also Jenkins, who owed Thornton money, and Parker, who lost his store." Sienna served the food, then sat across from him. "We need to find proof. Something that connects someone definitively to the murder." Thornton kept detailed records in his office. "If there's evidence, it would be there." "Then that's where we need to look," Sienna decided. "Tonight." Miles stared at her. "That's too dangerous." "The sheriff is likely at home after a long day of searching for you," she finished. "The office will be empty. We can slip in after midnight when the town is asleep." Miles shook his head firmly. "No, I'll go alone." Sienna's green eyes flashed. "You're still injured. You're a wanted man, and you need someone to keep watch." "I'm coming with you, Mr. Crawford, and that's final." Their gazes locked in silent battle until, surprisingly, Miles's lips twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met, Miss Roberts." "So I've been told," she replied, allowing her own smile to show. "Eat your dinner. We have a long night ahead." Under the cover of darkness, they rode into Whispering Pines. The town was quiet, most windows dark except for the saloon, where piano music and raucous laughter spilled onto the empty street. They left their horses behind the abandoned livery stable and made their way cautiously to Thornton's office. "There's no guard," Miles whispered, surprised. "I would have thought they'd post someone." "The sheriff probably doesn't expect you to return to the scene of the crime," Sienna reasoned. "Can you pick the lock?" Miles produced a thin metal tool from his pocket. "An unfortunate skill from my more reckless youth." Within minutes, they were inside the darkened office. Sienna lit a small lantern, keeping the flame low, while Miles went straight to the large desk that dominated the room. "Look for correspondence about the railroad deal or the Denver company," he instructed, rifling through drawers. Sienna examined the bookshelf, noting the meticulous organization. "He was certainly methodical. Made his fortune that way," Miles muttered, examining papers. "Everything calculated down to the last penny." They searched in focused silence for nearly half an hour. Sienna found ledgers detailing land purchases throughout the county, including offers made for Miles's ranch at progressively higher amounts. Miles discovered letters from the railroad company confirming plans for the new spur line, but nothing that clearly pointed to Thornton's killer. "There has to be something," Sienna whispered, frustration edging her voice. She ran her fingers along the edge of the desk, then paused. "Miles, is this drawer locked?" He moved to her side, examining the small drawer beneath the main writing surface. "It is. Let me try." After some delicate maneuvering with his lockpick, the drawer slid open to reveal a leather-bound journal and several folded documents. "This might be what we need," Miles said, opening the journal. Sienna unfolded one of the documents and scanned it quickly. "Miles, this is a contract between Thornton and Mayor Wells. They were partners in the land scheme." Miles looked up from the journal, his expression grim. And according to Thornton's notes, Wells was skimming money. There's an entry from the day of the murder saying he planned to confront Wells and dissolve their partnership. A floorboard creaked outside the door. Sienna quickly extinguished the lantern as Miles gathered the journal and documents. "Someone's coming," she whispered, heart pounding. Miles pulled her behind the desk just as the door swung open. Light from a bull's-eye lantern swept the room. Through the gap beneath the desk, Sienna could see polished boots stepping slowly into the office. "I know someone's in here," a voice called Mayor Harrison Wells himself. "Come out now, and perhaps we can come to an arrangement." Miles pressed a finger to his lips, then pointed to the window behind them. Sienna nodded in understanding. Slowly, they began inching toward it. "Is that you, Crawford?" Wells called, moving farther into the room. "Smart of you to come looking for evidence. Too bad you won't live to use it." The unmistakable sound of a revolver being cocked echoed in the silent office. Miles tensed beside Sienna, his hand moving to his own gun. Just then, a commotion erupted on the street outside. The saloon doors banged open, and several drunken cowboys spilled out, shouting and laughing. Wells turned toward the window, momentarily distracted. Miles seized the opportunity. In one fluid motion, he stood and aimed his revolver. "Drop the gun, Wells." The mayor spun back, his own weapon raised, but froze at the sight of Miles's steady aim. "Crawford," he spat. "Should have known you'd be fool enough to come back." "We found your contract with Thornton," Miles said evenly, "and his journal detailing your theft. He was going to expose you the night he died." "So you killed him," Sienna added, rising from behind the desk, "and framed Miles because his land was crucial to your railroad deal." Wells's eyes darted between them, calculating. "It's your word against mine. A murderer and an outsider woman. Who do you think the town will believe?" "Perhaps they'll believe this," came a new voice from the doorway. Sheriff Matthews stood there, his deputy beside him, both with weapons drawn. "We've been watching the office since Crawford escaped yesterday. Figured he might return for evidence." Sienna felt her heart sink. After everything they'd discovered, they were about to be arrested or worse. But to her surprise, Matthews stepped past them and trained his gun on Mayor Wells. "Lower your weapon, Harrison." Wells's face contorted with rage. "Have you lost your mind, Matthews? Crawford is the murderer here." "That's so." The sheriff nodded toward the journal in Miles's hand. "What's in there that's got you so spooked you'd pull a gun in the middle of the night?" "Evidence that Wells was stealing from Thornton," Miles answered, never taking his eyes off the mayor. "And that Thornton planned to confront him the night he was murdered." Matthews extended his hand. "Let me see that." Reluctantly, Miles passed over the journal. As the sheriff quickly scanned the pages, Wells saw his opportunity. He lunged toward the window, firing wildly as he moved. Sienna cried out as pain blazed across her arm. Miles returned fire in the same instant, his bullet catching Wells in the leg. The mayor crashed to the floor, his gun skittering across the floorboards. "Sienna!" Miles was at her side instantly, examining her wounded arm. "How bad is it?" "Just a graze," she assured him, though the pain was intense. "I'm all right." The sheriff's deputy secured Wells while Matthews continued reading the journal. Finally, he looked up, his weathered face grave. "This changes things," he admitted. "Wells was embezzling from their partnership. Thornton discovered it and planned to dissolve their arrangement, which would have ruined Wells financially and politically. Thornton's gun was used in the murder," Miles pointed out. "Wells must have arranged to meet him that night, used Thornton's own weapon, then sent me that note to arrive just after." Matthews nodded slowly. "And the mayor conveniently suggested we search your ranch first when you escaped." He turned to Wells. "You've got a lot to answer for, Harrison." As the deputy dragged a cursing Wells away, the sheriff faced Miles and Sienna. "You two took one hell of a risk coming here tonight." "We had no choice," Sienna replied, wincing as she pressed a handkerchief to her bleeding arm. An innocent man's life was at stake. Matthews studied them for a long moment. "Miss Roberts, you showed remarkable bravery for a man you barely know." "She believes in justice, Sheriff," Miles said quietly, his hand supporting her uninjured arm. "As do I." The sheriff holstered his weapon with a sigh. "Crawford, consider yourself no longer a wanted man. But next time you find a body, maybe don't pick up the murder weapon, eh?" He gestured to Sienna's arm. "Now let's get the lady to Doc Sullivan before she bleeds all over Thornton's fancy carpet." Word spread quickly through Whispering Pines. By morning, everyone knew that Mayor Wells had murdered Samuel Thornton and framed Miles Crawford. The evidence was irrefutable, not only Thornton's journal, but Wells's own confession once he realized the game was up. Sienna sat on the doctor's porch, her arm properly bandaged, watching as townspeople gathered in small clusters to discuss the shocking turn of events. Many glanced her way with newfound respect, while others looked ashamed for having so quickly condemned an innocent man. "How does it feel to be the town hero?" Miles asked, settling into the chair beside her. He looked different today, clean-shaven, rested, the hunted look gone from his eyes. "I'm hardly that," she demurred. "I simply couldn't stand by and watch an injustice." "Your father would be proud," Miles said softly. Sienna smiled at the thought. "Yes, I believe he would." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the town go about its business in the morning light. "What will you do now?" Sienna finally asked. "Return to your ranch." "That's the plan." Miles turned to look at her directly. "But I find myself reluctant to say goodbye to the brave woman who saved my life and my name." Something fluttered in Sienna's chest. "Perhaps you don't have to, not yet at least." His eyes warmed. "No." "My cabin gets lonely sometimes," she admitted, "and your leg still needs proper care." Miles smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed his entire face. "Miss Roberts, are you inviting me to stay with you?" "For your recovery, of course," she replied primly, though she couldn't help returning his smile. "What would people say? They'd say I'm the luckiest man in the territory." His hand found hers and he squeezed it gently. "And they'd be right." 3 days later, they returned to Sienna's cabin together. Miles's name had been formally cleared. Wells was awaiting trial in the territorial prison, and the town of Whispering Pines was slowly coming to terms with how quickly they'd rushed to judgment. As summer turned to autumn, Miles's visits to Sienna's cabin became more frequent and extended. They would sit on her porch in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in gold and crimson. Sometimes they talked for hours, other times they enjoyed comfortable silence. It was during one such sunset in late September that Miles finally spoke the words that had been building between them for weeks. "I love you, Sienna Roberts," he said simply, his voice as steady as the mountains on the horizon. "I think I started falling for you the moment you lied to a posse to save a stranger." Sienna turned to him, her heart full. "And I love you, Miles Crawford, though I'd appreciate if you'd stop getting into situations where I need to rescue you." He laughed and pulled her closer. "No promises." "You're remarkably good at it." Their kiss was tender and unhurried, filled with the promise of all the days to come. When they finally parted, Miles took her hand in his. "I've been thinking about the future," he said. "My ranch is still mine, and with Thornton gone, there's no pressure to sell. But it feels empty now, too big for just one person." "Is that so?" Sienna asked, her eyes twinkling. "It needs someone to make it a home." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Someone who knows her own mind and isn't afraid to speak it." Someone brave enough to stand against an entire town when she believes in something. Are you proposing, Mr. Crawford? With all my heart, Miss Roberts. His blue eyes were earnest in the fading light. Will you marry me and make a home with me? I can't promise it will always be easy, but I can promise you'll never face anything alone again. Tears welled in Sienna's eyes. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I will. Their wedding took place on a crisp October morning. To their surprise, much of Whispering Pines turned out for the ceremony. Sheriff Matthews stood as Miles's best man, while Doc Sullivan gave Sienna away in place of her father. Even Mrs. Patterson contributed a wedding cake, her way of apologizing for believing the worst about Miles. As they exchanged vows beneath the golden leaves of an old cottonwood tree, Sienna thought about the strange path that had led her here. 8 months ago, she'd been a lonely schoolteacher seeking a new beginning. Now she stood hand in hand with a man she'd risked everything to save, surrounded by a community that had learned a powerful lesson about judgment and redemption. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the preacher declared. You may kiss your bride. As Miles drew her into his arms, the gathered crowd erupted in cheers. When they turned to face their guests, Sienna saw something that moved her deeply. One by one, the townspeople lowered their eyes in respect, acknowledging without words their part in nearly condemning an innocent man. Look, Miles whispered, noticing the same thing. They finally understand. Better late than never, she replied softly. That evening, as they rode to Miles's ranch, their ranch now, Sienna reflected on how quickly life could change. A single decision made in a moment of courage had altered everything. What are you thinking about, Mrs. Crawford? Miles asked, riding beside her. The name sent a thrill through her. About choices, and how the most frightening ones often lead to the greatest happiness. Like helping a wanted man, like trusting my heart when everyone else was saying I was wrong. She reached across to take his hand. I'd do it all again, you know. I know you would. Miles's smile was tender. That's why I love you. As they crested the final hill and his ranch came into view, a sturdy house nestled in a valley with mountains rising beyond, Miles reined his horse to a stop. Welcome home, Sienna. Home. The word filled her with warmth. This was what she'd been searching for when she'd left Philadelphia all those months ago. Not just a place, but a purpose. A love worth fighting for. It's beautiful, she said, taking in the sprawling ranch with its creek and cottonwoods, cattle grazing in the distance. It's ours, Miles corrected. Every acre, every stone, the land no one could take from us. As they continued down the hill toward their future, Sienna knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. With a man whose name she had cleared through her bravery, in a town that had finally learned to see the truth, building a life founded on justice and love. 1 year later, Sienna stood on the porch of their ranch house, cradling their newborn daughter in her arms. Miles leaned against the railing beside her, pride and love evident in every line of his face. She has your eyes, he observed softly, touching the infant's tiny hand. And your stubborn chin, Sienna replied with a smile. Heaven help us all. They had named her Hope, for all that they had nearly lost and miraculously found. The past year had brought changes to more than just their family. Whispering Pines was growing again, but differently than Samuel Thornton had envisioned. Without his monopolistic practices, smaller ranchers and farmers were thriving. The railroad had still come through, but with fair compensation to all landowners along the route. Miles had been elected to the town council, his reputation now stronger than ever. Sienna had started a small school for the children of nearby ranches, fulfilling her love of teaching while remaining close to home. You ever think about how differently things might have turned out? Miles asked, slipping an arm around her waist. Sienna leaned into his embrace. Sometimes. If I hadn't been gathering herbs that day, if the posse had gone east instead of believing my lie, if you hadn't been brave enough to stand up for a stranger. She looked down at their sleeping daughter, then up at the man she loved. I think some things are meant to be, no matter what path we take to get there. Miles pressed a kiss to her temple. I think you're right, Mrs. Crawford. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and pink, they stood together on the porch of the home they'd built, not just the physical structure, but the life they'd created together. A life born from courage, sustained by truth, and filled with love. The town had finally lowered their eyes in respect, but Miles and Sienna had raised theirs to the horizon, to the future they would forge together. And it was beautiful beyond measure.